Hi, my name is Iris Capdevila and I work at the Teaching Support Center at EPFL, providing pedagogical advice to sections and teachers.
Hi, I'm Jolene De Lima, and just like Iris, I too am a pedagogical advisor at the Teaching Support Center at EPFL. A major part of our job is to support teachers on their journey to improve the teaching and learning process in their classrooms. Before we go any further, I would like to point out that to get the most out of this video, it would be a good idea to watch the video called Student Evaluation of Teaching, Why, When and How first. The feedback process starts much before you actually get the paper with student feedback in your hands. And as you would have seen in that video, there is a lot of planning that goes into designing and implementing the instruments which you will use to get feedback. So again, if you have not watched that video yet, feel free to pause this one for the moment and go and watch it. So, if you are here, I assume you have watched the video on student evaluation of teaching. In brief, my colleagues highlighted the evidence that supports the importance of student feedback in the learning process. In fact, of the various educational interventions measured, getting student feedback on your teaching had the highest effect on student learning. Additionally, using our institution as an example, they walked you through the before and during steps of the feedback process. And now, we will talk about what happens when we get the student feedback. So let's jump in, getting student feedback. Whoa, that was a lot of feedback, and all at once. How did it make you feel? Stressed? Overwhelmed? A bit defensive? These are all very normal reactions to feedback. In this video, we will share one method that can help you process your feedback in a way that will support your future teaching. We will give you some tips on how to manage your emotions, walk you through some suggestions on engaging objectively with the feedback, and give you some tips on how to leverage the feedback that you get so as to improve your teaching. The advice that we are going to share is not prescriptive. It is just one possible tool that you can use and is very flexible. So please feel free to adapt it to suit your needs. Now, my colleague Iris will walk you through the first step.
So, first step. What is the first step to an objective analysis of a course? Before going directly into the process, I would like to ask you something. What makes a good course good? How can we evaluate this? We are talking here about the student evaluation of teaching, and you may be wondering, why should they decide? What if there are mixed opinions on one same aspect? So who gets to decide if a course is good or not? How should we address this process? So when we explore the literature, we find Brookfield's lenses model of reflection. He suggests that to have a general and complete overview of a course, we should analyze it through 4 different lenses. The first one is the teacher's lens, so your perspective and your experience on the course. Then, the student's lens. How did they perceive and receive the course? What was their experience? Thirdly, the theoretical lens. This one refers to what the literature says about teaching and learning. What evidence supports good teaching and learning practices? And finally, the peer's lens. What do your colleagues think about the course? What are their insights on the way you have designed it or your teaching approach? You could, for example, invite them to one of your sessions. As we want this process to be doable, significant, and ready for you to put it into practice, if you feel like it, we are going to mainly focus on the 2 actors that are for sure present in your course. so you, the teacher's lens, and your students, so the student's lens. We're going to mention the theoretical lens, but we are not going to develop it in this video, nor the peer's lens. We are aware that for it we need to coordinate with other teachers, which sometimes can be difficult, or we may not be comfortable in having colleagues seeing us teaching. So let's first focus on things that are in our hands, and then in the future you might want to include this extra lens. So are you ready to go through them? Let's start. We are going to begin with you, your perspective, and so we are going to self-reflect on the course. For that, we encourage you to ask yourself some questions. What do you think are the good characteristics of a course? How does your course map into these characteristics? And what evidence supports your choice? To carry out this self-reflection, we are going to share with you a very practical tool that can guide us through this process. It is our revisited version of the Wheel of Life, a concept attributed to Paul Meyer, who was a pioneer in coaching. We have adapted it to a teaching-learning approach, and we call it Wheel for Improvement. Now, we invite you to do it yourselves right now with us. So please download and print the PDF document that you will find attached in the description of the video, or just get a piece of paper and a pen and join us to answer these questions together. So, to answer the first question, what do I think are the characteristics of a good course? The first thing we're going to do is think of 8 characteristics that, from your perspective, a good course needs to have. To help you, you can revise the characteristics that my colleague shared in the previous video when explaining the dimensions of teaching. Write each characteristic in an intersection, just like I'm doing in here, and in here. You can pause the video and take your time to come up with your 8 characteristics. Once you have all the 8 characteristics, you're going to focus on the second and third questions. So, how does my course map within these characteristics? To do so, you are going to evaluate the level of achievement or presence of these characteristics in your course, from 0 to 10, being 0 not present at all, and 10 very present. When evaluating them, think of the evidence that support your choice. For example, if I think that course organization is an important aspect for a good course, and I evaluate it with a 9, like this, I can support it because I know that I provide a clear syllabus at the beginning of the year that I refer to in each of one of my lectures. So once you have decided the value that you give to each of these 8 aspects, draw a small circle in the X for each concept, like I'm doing in mine. For example, like here, and here, and here. Again, you can pause the video and dedicate the time you need to go through your wheel. Once you have all your dots, you can link them together. Now, if you have a look at your wheel, what information comes to you? Is the wheel round enough to fluently circulate, or there are some aspects that difficult this movement? After this short activity, you may be already identifying some strengths and some flaws from your course. Do you? Does this visual mapping help you? We hope so. Right now, we are going to let it simmer for a bit, and we will come back to it later on. Before moving on and following the cooking metaphor, let's have a moment to digest what we have done so far to analyze the course from the teacher's lens. Firstly, you have identified 8 characteristics that a good course should have. Secondly, you have mapped your course into these characteristics. And finally, you have identified your strengths and potential improvements. Now my colleague Jolene will introduce the next lens.
So, now that you have reflected on your course using the teacher's lens, it is time to shift focus onto the next lens, the student's lens. It is time to open that file with all the student feedback and read it. All those emotions are coming right back up, aren't they? Well, that's okay. In their book on facilitating experiential learning in higher education, Tommy and Isaac talk about some strategies that experienced teachers use to manage their emotions while teaching. We can use this as a guide to think of managing emotions while dealing with student feedback too. Some of the techniques they suggest include using relaxation techniques, self-talk, or rethinking a situation to see if it could be reconsidered in a more positive or constructive way. Now that we have got a handle on how to manage the emotions we might experience, let's try and explore the student feedback in an objective manner. Before you look into the data and comments, look at the response rate. This will allow you to determine if the feedback you receive is representative of the whole class or if it could be possibly skewed towards the extremes. Another important thing to keep in mind is that while the course was one experience for you, each of your students could have a different perspective and so a different take on what happened during the course. Now, work through the student feedback systematically. Objectively reflect on the positives and negatives of the student experience. Begin with the quantitative data that you have and start making 2 lists. One of the positive points they identified and one of the points they think can be improved. As far as possible, try to use the same main themes you used when you were reflecting on the characteristics of a good course. Then, as you start reading the comments, integrate them with the quantitative data that you have. One simple way of doing that is to simply add tally marks as you go. Here, I have added purple tally marks to indicate comments that illustrated the positive aspect of these themes, and orange tally marks to indicate comments that highlighted negative aspects. You will usually find a mixture of both. Remember, these are all different perspectives. Remember to be very careful of the weight you give each comment. Be careful to ensure that a single comment does not take more importance than others. For example, just because one student thought that the workload was acceptable, that does not supersede 13 other students who thought that the workload was too high. Similarly, don't beat yourself up over that one comment that said that the class dynamics were not good. When you have worked through all the data and comments, it is now time to begin integrating the 2 lenses. You will have already mapped your perspectives about the course onto this wheel. Now, using the same wheel, add your students' perspectives. Take a minute to reflect on the student's perspective. What, according to them, are the strengths of the course? And what are some of the areas they identify as needing improvement? Before we go into the next phase, let's briefly review what we talked about. We touched on some strategies to help us manage our emotions, how to try and objectively work through the student feedback, and mapping students' perspectives onto the wheel for improvement. Now, Iris will walk you through the next step.
So far, we have been reflecting on the teacher's perspective. We have acknowledged the student's one, and now it is time to bring both perspectives together and integrate the information. We should have something that looks like this, which should help us move from the reflection phase to a more active one, where we can transfer this information into something tangible. As before, we're going to ask ourselves some questions. Which are the aspects that both yourself and your students agree? In this case, I could say this one, more or less, this one, this one, this one. Which are the aspects that both yourself and your students disagree? In this one, we can see these two cases. Are there any other aspects that students have highlighted through their comments? So let's illustrate it with an example. Imagine that for my course, both my students and I agree in these two aspects: course organization and workload. Are these aspects evaluated positively or not? For course organization, we both agree that it is a strength of the course. On the other hand, we both agree that the workload is not appropriate. In this case, I would keep organizing my course the way I do, since it seems appropriate both for me and my students. But I need to revise its workload. The next step is to pay attention to the aspects we disagree. In this example, class dynamics and assessment. So here, we could ask ourselves, why is there this gap? Why did I evaluate this aspect this way? Is there evidence supporting my choice from my experience, from the literature? And in here is where we add and when we include the theoretical lens. After the student's feedback, do I still think that I should keep doing or organizing this aspect this way? If the answer is yes, go for it, since we have some arguments supporting our choice. If you want, you can explain them to the students. If, on the contrary, the feedback from the students provided you new information that makes you see it differently and consider the possibility to improve, you should note this aspect down for change. For example, following this hypothetical case, my students tell me that they would rather only have one final written multiple-choice question exam. However, right now, the course has a continuous assessment, and I want to keep it like this because there's evidence that formative assessment fosters learning, and also, from my perspective, this feedback helps me adapt the teaching. So I'm going to keep the assessment like this. On the other side, they have stated that the lectures are too passive and that they would like to have more interaction. I see a point there, and I consider that I could improve it by, for example, introducing some polling questions and peer discussions. So in this other case, I note down that I want to improve the class dynamics. So at the end of the process, you will have spotted some things that you can improve, bearing in mind your perspective, the student's perspective, and what literature says. So now that you have identified them, let me ask you, do you have the power and/or the resources to change those? Can you change them all? Do you have the energy to do so? One thing that usually happens is that, as we have said before, we feel overwhelmed on the things we could change and improve. Usually, we don't even know where to start. That is why it is important to focus our energy on specific actions. So a last and a very important question. Which aspect do you feel that if you focus on it, if you improve it, it will have a positive impact on the others. Let's say that you can take one of these 8 dots and you can pull it all the way up in the wheel for improvement. Which one of these dots would you choose? This aspect is going to be your lever. Take a moment to have a look at your wheel for improvement and tell us, what is your lever? Once you have identified it, let's put all the focus and efforts on this specific characteristic. How can you improve it? What resources do you have? Bear in mind as well the potential consequences that these changes will have on the other aspects. And at the end, how are you going to evaluate the impact of these changes? This last question is the link that allows us to close the cycle and start it again by designing the questionnaire for the next course. This cycle closes and triggers the beginning of another one, which is, in the end, an evolved version of the one we just did.
The objective of this video was to leverage the feedback you get so as to improve your teaching. We started by touching on some strategies that you can use to manage your emotions during this process.
We then shared with you the process through which we can objectively analyze a course from different lenses. First of all, the teacher's perspective, facilitated by the wheel for improvement.
Then, we spoke about some tips to help you analyze the student's perspective and also map that onto the wheel for improvement.
And finally, bringing it all together to identify concrete actions that can be taken for the next course, which is the step that closes the cycle and sets the base for preparing next year's questionnaire.
We hope this has been useful. Feel free to adapt it to your needs and use the tips in a way that is meaningful and relevant to you. Thank you.